Jesus founded a movement and not a church. He and his earliest disciples had to have the flexibility to move where they needed to go, to do what they needed to do to achieve their mission. It was straightforward and simple. Somehow, for 2,000 years since then, however, the church has spent a lot of time systematizing, structuring, codifying, institutionalizing, so that now we have layers and layers of bureaucracy, bureaucratic clutter, really, that get in the way of ministry. Bureaucracy slows things down, it regulates things. It's designed to keep things the same and prevent change, even when change is necessary. That's especially complicated when we think about the organizational models that churches often use now. They were models that were invented decades ago. And they really worked. They really worked when Christianity was at the center of American culture and people were beating down the doors to get in, and churches couldn't build fast enough to accommodate the overflow crowds. That's clearly not the world we live in now. But we have these models that were invented for that time. And I think now we have a chance to rethink that. A typical, maybe not in your church, but a typical church model is to have a hierarchical structure where power rests at the top, that some executive committee pushes out ideas and energy to assist through a system of committees that meet on a regular basis and follow agendas and follow some kind of parliamentary procedure. In those kind of systems, control works from the top to the bottom, and it's really hard for energy and ideas to work the other way, from the bottom up. I would suggest that we have an opportunity to at least do things differently. And if we're going to do things differently, now seems to be a good time to try. We can no longer settle for the way we've always done it. Staying the same means falling behind in a world that's always changing. Think about that. Staying the same means falling behind in a world that's always changing. So churches have a choice. We can hunker down and hold on for dear life to the way things have always been. We know where that leads, or we can assume we know where that leads. Or we can courageously set aside what we think we know for the sake of new learning that can be transformative and even redemptive. If we want as churches to move toward being more organizationally nimble, there are some things we might consider. Here are just 10 things that would be on that list. 10 ways for churches to organize more nimbly. First, come together around a common purpose. Focus on answering these questions that are inspired by the brilliant organizational consultant Margaret Wheatley. Who are we right now? Not who were we back in the day, or who do we hope to be 5 or 10 or 20 years from now, but who are we right now? Look around and see who's here with us. What can we do now that we're together? And what is the highest purpose to which God is calling us? When a purpose is clearly stated and understood by all people, It frees up the system to explore new ways of functioning. It relieves the pressure of management because if people know the purpose, they can make decisions on their own accordingly in whatever circumstance they find themselves. Balance, order, and chaos. Too much order leads to stagnation. Too much chaos risks spinning off into randomness without being able to get anything done. So both are needed for healthy organizations to grow. And they work in tension. They work best in tension with each other. The master church consultant Gil Randall, in his excellent book, Journey in the Wilderness, says wilderness is the churchy word for chaos. We're now in uncharted territory. We've been in the wilderness for decades. Every thriving organization needs a little chaos now and then. Organize for now and not forever. Make the most of every moment. Acknowledge that nothing lasts forever. That even the best plans are obsolete the moment they're rolled out because the world has a way of getting in the way of the best laid plans. Create a system in which groups form based on shared interests or passions that serve the greater purpose. Let them rise up, do their thing, and then disband when they're done. Serving God should be exciting and inviting, not obligatory and routine. There is no need to create a system and perpetuate a system where people's arms are twisted to serve on this committee or that committee that meets on this day or that day every month in perpetuity. Relatedly, let things die that need to die, and let things be born that are waiting to be born. I've heard that death and resurrection are sort of central to this Christian faith. So think about things like the committee that no one wants to serve on anymore. About the program that was awesome when it started, but really isn't anymore and takes more work than it's worth. Letting things die is an act of faith, and it is an act of courage. Create a culture of experimentation. Try things, knowing that some things are going to work and some things are going to fail. The critical part is learning from mistakes and failures. Let grace abound for ourselves and for others. Be curious instead of certain. Explore and discover. Make room for joy and delight, even for wonder and awe. Relatedly, be ready and willing to be surprised by God. Notice where God might be when we let God loose from the sanctuary on Sunday mornings. Where else is God showing up? Is God still speaking or what? And if God is still speaking, can God get a word in edgewise? Are we paying enough attention to notice? A common custom of church council meetings is to begin and end meetings with prayer, right? Called bookend prayers, right? We pray at the beginning, we pray at the end, and all hell breaks loose in between. Or at least no place is found for God in the deliberations. We can do better than that, I think. Invite and affirm diversity. Diverse systems we know are stronger and more durable and more enduring. Find ways to take advantage of different perspectives, skills, abilities, and passions. Pay attention to people on the edges of the bell curve, people who aren't all like us, people who have different takes on things. And we can benefit, especially from listening to new members and visitors. They're the ones who are experiencing our congregations as they are now, and they're bringing their hopes and their dreams and their ideas and passions. So listen to new members and visitors, learn from them, and even let them into leadership. Some churches, I would think many churches have requirements that you have to be a member for so long before you can be in leadership. Well, I would say that from a healthy organizational perspective, that sort of runs counter to what's needed. That we need to hear new voices along with the old voices and to merge those together. Learn to have conversations with each other. Really talk and really listen. Create sacred space in which all people are heard and validated as their fullest selves, with their hopes and dreams, their anxieties, their fears. Create that kind of space that can be a blessing to every person. It can transform relationships. It can deepen and broaden relationships. It can also be experienced as wonderfully beneficial um, to as a validation for those who are part of the process. Listening is an act of love. And Mr. Rogers, in all of his wisdom, says listening is where love begins. So have conversations and don't fill all the space. Become comfortable with silence, as magical things can happen in moments of silence. Find an alternative to Robert's rules. Robert's rules, I've done this presentation a number of times, and I am quite confident that I could have walked into any of those rooms and said, we're going to not use the Bible, we're going to worship the devil, and we're going to stop using Robert's rules. And what people would have perked up about was the stopping the use of Robert's rules. But Robert's rules stifle conversation. They limit collaboration. They create adversaries where there might not be adversaries otherwise. And they ensure that people who know the rules win the game. So ultimately, using Robert's rules is a justice issue. There are lots of examples of different ways to have meaningful conversations and make decisions together. I lift up two in particular here. Pure Spirit Circle Process from Baldwin and Linnea, and World Cafe Conversations by Brown and Isaacs. And finally, stop counting and start celebrating. Focus on living life, not avoiding death. That might involve rethinking membership. Think about why you have membership requirements in the first place. What purpose have they served in the past, and what purpose do they serve now? Find ways to value and incorporate every gift that's offered by whoever offers it. That includes people in the pews every Sunday for the last 90 years, visitors who just show up every once in a while, people passing by on the street. What gifts do all of those folks have to offer that can contribute to your common purpose and your mission as a congregation? One way to frame this is to ask people to take what you need and give what you can. At the end of the day, every congregation everywhere has something to live for, something that they can uniquely contribute to the work of the church in the world. Many blessings as you clear away bureaucratic clutter and live into your reason for being and all that God calls you to be.
Hi, I'm Larry Pierce. I am the visiting professor in practical ministry at Lancaster Theological Seminary. I teach a course in the doctorate program entitled Developing Leaders, Cultivating Partnership. I'm glad to join in this video conference with you. My topic is adaptive leadership in a new day dawning, leading the church towards the light. Obviously, a clearing has opened up before us in this post-COVID time. I say that with fingers crossed. In this time in which we have experienced something that is not only global, but also profound, that draws upon all of our capacities, both spiritual, organizational, spiritual, and interpersonal. And leadership encompasses all those domains. So in adaptive leadership, I think we gain some perspectives and some practices that can help us as we find our way through this clearing before us, as we try to navigate and not only find a new day dawning, but help to create that new day dawning through our own ways of leading. I'm going to draw upon some of the work of one of the teachers of adaptive leadership, Ron Heifetz, as I try to share with you some of his perspectives and practices on leadership and their relevance for this time that we are in. The pandemic has prompted us to improvise, whether we liked it or not. The real challenge before us is, can we continue to improvise when we don't have to? And leadership is an improvisational art, says Heifetz and Linsky in their article, A Survival Guide for Leaders. They continue, you may be guided by an overarching vision, clear values, a strategic plan, but what you actually do from moment to moment cannot be scripted. It's like a Jewish consultant friend of mine says, we plan and God laughs. That might very well be the case, but in any case, you must respond in leadership as an improvisational art as events unfold. Certainly that's been our experience during this pandemic. To sustain good leadership then requires first and foremost the capacity to see what is happening to you and your initiative as it's happening, and to understand how today's turns in the road will affect tomorrow's plans. So it's definitely understanding leadership as an art, not a 7-step plan. Leadership as including adaptability and improvisation, because as we act, that creates new conditions. Those new conditions create new opportunities for acting, and it's a kind of iterative and reiterative process. So as I move forward, I'm going to draw on some other ways of understanding leadership as adapting. And I want to highlight that this is definitely a perspective that leads to practices that can serve us as we lead in this emerging future before us. Another way to understand our moment is to recognize that we are on the edge of the unknown, that we are taking journeys towards an emerging future, and that these journeys towards an emerging future, a journey towards a destination, the results of which are not known, or the route is not always known, are integral to our religious traditions, in the Jewish tradition, in the Christian tradition, and in other traditions as well. There are these stories of embarking on a journey with faith, with imagination, and with some sense of courage and fortitude, inspired, hopefully, and upheld and companioned by the Spirit that allow us to get through. My teacher in narrative therapy was Michael White, and I like applying some of his insights to leadership. He wrote, when we sit down together, I know that we are embarking on a journey to a destination that cannot be precisely specified, and via routes that cannot be predetermined. And I know that the adventures to be had on these journeys are not about the confirmation of what is already known, but about expeditions into what is possible for people to know about their lives. Yes, it's those expeditions that allow us, I think, to recognize that there's oftentimes a gap between what is and what could be, and that leadership requires naming those gaps, perceiving them, observing them, sensing them. And we've become so sensitized in this recent year to all the gaps that exist in our societies. The gap between our use of resources of the earth and actually the limits of the earth's resources. The gaps between the conditions that people might find themselves in because of their identities or their heritage, and what is possible for others with different identities and heritages. The gap that is created by a system of a caste system that has defined this country, and the gap between justice and the so glaring realization of racial injustice in our country. So the gap between what is and what can be is oftentimes the impetus for leading in some different ways, towards some different ways, with routes that are not always paths that are not always known. So it's really helpful for a leader to be able to acknowledge the gaps rather than to avoid them, to name the gaps rather than let them be undefined, and to help those that we are leading in a community or an organization to begin to articulate their own experiences of those gaps, their own experience from where they are to where they would like to be, their own experience of being caught up in a culture and a society in which the gaps between income and the disparities that people experience because of their identities or their heritage are so glaring. And to be able to name those experiences and to recognize the systemic, the organizational, as well as the personal challenges that provides for leadership, I think is essential at this moment in this clearing. To have come out of this pandemic without a shift in our personal and social consciousness, I think would have been a lost opportunity. And it's that consciousness, that changing of our personal and social consciousness, that I think allows us to develop an agenda of not only what should happen, but how we might lead. So this is where I will turn to Heifetz's work again to make a useful distinction between technical challenges and adaptive challenges, the first and the third row in this table. The technical challenges are those where the problem is clear, the solution to the problem is clear, and the locus of the work or the authority is usually in the experts that know how to implement that particular solution. So when the pandemic first broke out, people were scrambling to put together some technical solutions to the challenge of moving everything that they did, worship, education, pastoral care, and caring for one another, and creating community, to virtual environments. So the problem was clear. We can't meet together. We have to social distance, but we want to continue, and we want to continue in a virtual platform. And the solution was getting the technology, creating the various mechanisms for being able to do what congregations or organizations did in a virtual way. And oftentimes those who had the expertise and those platforms that were useful were the ones that we turned to. Now, adaptive challenge is very different, because in adaptive challenges, and we face a number of them right now, the problem itself requires learning, requires discernment, requires deep listening, requires sensing and attending in ways that allow us to get clearer and clearer about the problem. So one of the challenges that's an adaptive one as we move to this hopefully post-pandemic time is to ask ourselves, how do we, in our worship, in our learning, in our other ways of engagement in a multiple platform world, how do we create presence and not just performance? How do we create connection and not just communication? As we move to more and more towards some multiple platform ways of doing what we do as congregations or organizations, it really becomes a challenge for us to think about how do we maintain not just more accessibility to people through the multiple platforms that we're using, but also how do we create community that's also vital, transformative, and connected for folks. So those are adaptive challenges, and the solution is not an easy 5-step plan. It's not a ready-made solution. It requires learning, it requires growing, it requires changing not just what we're doing, but how we think about what we're doing. And so that gives us an entree into the adaptive work. I'm just using multiple platform, moving towards multiple platform as a suggestion, easy illustration of what I'm trying to say. The other important part about adaptive work is the leader does not take it all on themselves, but they try to engage all of those who have a stake in bringing about and respond some solutions, some changes, those who need to engage in the learning to understand the rationale for the changes. The big mistake many leaders make is they take on too much of the responsibility for moving through an adaptive challenge, and then they look behind them and they see that no one's following. The big mistake that many leaders make is they try to have an adaptive challenge that doesn't have an easy solution. They try to turn that into a technical challenge and think they have done something when really there's so much more to do. So there are some disciplines in adaptive leadership. I name it 3 of these. I've translated Heifetz's work into some different words. And one is just observing, really seeing what is, naming, articulating what is, and gathering the different perspectives of others from their social location, from their different experiences on what are they seeing. I want you to think about that image of the story of the blind man and the elephant, where each has a different part of the elephant and therefore is describing their experiences more like a tree if they're holding on to the leg, or a fan if they're holding on to the ear of the elephant. So creating opportunities for deep observing and communal observing that then can lead to communal hermeneutics or interpretation, and that's the discerning. Given our varied experiences, the next discipline is discerning. How do we make sense of this? Why does this matter? What are we coming to understand as a result of the deep listening and deep sensing that comes through observing? And given our discernment of what it is that we've observed, given our making sense of it, what are some various ways that we can innovate, try, take risk, begin to do some experiments towards the solution, and always create the opportunity for learning, reflecting, making course corrections, innovating, improvising along the way. That's the discipline before us. And I think one of the things for us to pay attention to in our observing is the readiness of the organizations that we are part of. We all ask the question sometimes in spiritual discernment, how is it with your soul? And I'm going to raise the question, how is it with your soil as we think about the congregations or the organizations that we're working with? What is the readiness? And of course, I'm drawing from that gospel parable of the sower and the seed, and that the seed falls on different kinds of soil. And so that's why Walter Brueggemann talks about this as the parable of the soils. And each congregation, each organization has a different availability to any kind of change, any kind of learning, any type of growing. So some might be more ready than others. Some of what we're trying to sow or bring about in our leadership may be on a path that has no soil. so it can't take root, or soil that is so rocky that there's work that needs to happen or things that need to do in order for it to take root, or soil with thorns that recognizes that there might be struggle and conflict and difference in order to bring about a change. And there are those places of good soil as well. So adaptive leadership requires us to discern the readiness for any change that we're trying to implement in our congregations or in our organizations. And so the first question I want you to think about as you think about a particular kind of change or adaptive challenge that you want to bring about in your particular setting is, what soil? What is the level of readiness of this congregation for the kind of change that I'm proposing? What is the readiness to adaptability in this organization? Because we have to start with what is before we can get to what can be. So that requires observing, and it also requires discerning. Otto Schammer has been a great teacher for me, and his theory U perspective on which is articulated in a number of publications, but this one, leading from the emerging future, is one that I would highly recommend. And recognizing in the title itself, it's not leading towards, but it's leading from the emerging future. And so there needs to be implicit in that understanding that usually there is a future that wants to emerge, and we need to be able to take the path towards that future that wants to emerge. But that requires some disciplines on our part. And Otto Schammer outlines some of that path from here to there. So you can maybe trace the U at the bottom of this diagram that starts with downloading past patterns. And certainly, as you think about engaging in any kind of adaptive work within your organization, one of the first things you need to do is to recognize you can't simply download past patterns. We learned that through the pandemic. We're going to continue to learn that it's not a matter of just downloading what was, but we have to take the journey towards suspending judgment, suspending prejudgment on what's needed or what we want to have happen, so that we can begin to see with fresh eyes what is, again, that observing spiritual, personal, and organizational discipline. And by seeing with fresh eyes what is, we can begin the journey of redirecting energy and redirecting people towards sensing not just themselves, but sensing the whole field, sensing not just their own particular organization, but sensing how does what we're doing in our congregation or in our organization, how does that respond to something in the broader field around us? And many of our congregations have engaged in some very meaningful and powerful work around racial injustice and doing the personal and spiritual work with that for the sake of their own members, but also for the sake of a world that is so wounded by the kind of injustices that we have become so aware of. And then it's a matter of letting go of what impedes our capacity to move towards the future that wants to emerge. And then we come to that bottom of the U, which Schammer calls connecting to source. We might call it connecting to spirit. And that requires presencing, really being in that place at the bottom there, really being present to what we have learned what is, and being present to what wants to be, and to not go back up the circle, the U on the left, but to be able to gather strength and resource from the source, and then be able to go up the U to letting come what wants to be, to allow things to organize themselves in some different ways, but it requires the action of the leadership, the activity of the leader to crystallize the vision and the intention that they are learning from others, and then creating pathways for enacting, not just keeping it in the imagination, not just keeping it in our thoughts or our intentions, but to kind of say, how do we learn towards the future by enacting, taking risks, doing small actions and seeing where they lead as we learn through experimenting what wants to become. And then the prototyping is where we link head, heart, and hand and create a prototype, not the final solution, not the permanent solution, but a practice field in which we can practice out some various ways of doing things differently moving forward so that we can then begin to embody that change. We can become the change that we want to see, as is often said. And then we're performing and we're acting from a place of the whole, from a more broader perspective, so that you takes us to some new territory in ourselves. And those disciplines that are implicit in this you are all leadership disciplines. So wondering how to lead in these ways. So having attended and joined with others in really sensing and learning and enacting, creating prototypes, we need to really be attentive to what is our compelling sense of call as religious leaders, as organizational leaders, as organization. What is the recommitment that we need to make? And that, I think, is one of the strongest disciplines of adaptive leadership, and that is moving people towards a commitment that they want to be and become and not just have. And really asking the question, what are we committed to moving forward? How do we enact that commitment? How do we bring it about? How do we make align our head, heart, and soul with that commitment and recognize when we have drifted away from it? What are the practices that will bring us back into alignment? So adaptive leadership really requires us, particularly in uncertain times, to have an open mind so that we're generating and cultivating curiosity around us rather than prejudgment. It means having an open heart so that our compassion is not just for ourselves or our own group, but a wide compassion that embraces the conditions and the experiences of others. And a courage that has the willingness to let go of what no longer serves the future that wants to emerge, but also letting that future come by our particular practices of taking risk, of experimenting, learning from those risks and experiments till we begin to develop a prototype of what might be. And so I encourage us as I end this short presentation with you to open your own heart, your own mind, open yourself to your own will and ask yourself, what is it that wants to come through you into the world as a leader? What do you need to sense and be attentive to so that you can do the adaptive work that learns along the way, that is able to make course corrections, that's able to improvise? I leave you with those questions because each of our contexts are different, but the art of leading as an improvisational art is one that includes all of those questions. So I wish you well on this journey. I wish you well as we step to the edge of the unknown together at this time in history and this time of the church. And I wish you all the faith, the courage, the imagination, the stamina, and the spiritual companionship that you need. So may it be.
Bishop Nathan Baxter, I am so happy to be here with you this morning. And as we think about the trajectory of the church going forward, I wonder if there are scriptures that have been important to you in your life as pastor and prophet.
Well, first, I do need to say how delighted I am to be with you, Marty. We are both senior adjuncts at Lancaster, and they allow us to get into all kinds of trouble. So it's good to be with you. Yes, there's this wonderful quote that the UCC uses: God is still speaking. And I have found during this season, two scriptures quickly came to mind. The one is from Jeremiah that says that there is hope for your future, and your children will return to their land or their borders. This is a message on the edge of the return from the exile. And of course, we know the rest of the story, as we see, as has been said. The other scripture that's meant a lot to me is, you have not chosen me. This is in John. You have not chosen me, but I have chosen you. And it gives me and has given me a sense that while there have been really discouraging moments during this COVID, I and the church, we have a call. God's chosen us for a special reason. We are salt, we are light. And I was so moved. I was doing some research and I found all of these medical journals, Mayo Clinic, one from the Journal of Medicine, that talked about the need for spirituality during COVID. And of course, so many in ministry, chaplains, pastors, evangelists, others, we have been really called to serve. And now that we're facing the challenge of re-entry into some kind of normalcy, it has been encouraging that God's called us and chosen us.
Yes.
So how do I listen?
Perfect. And so in the midst of the larger questions that we've been dealing with for decades about what is the trajectory of the church and where's the church going and how does the church move on from here, we experienced this pandemic that really has unsettled so much of what we thought was settled, right? And so we have this new opportunity to think again about church life. Can you name some of the lessons you think we can take from the pandemic and carry forward into the larger conversation about the life of the church?
I always like to think about and ask the question, what have we as pastors and the lay ministers learned during this time? And I've had the opportunity to talk to another number of ministers. One of the ministers of a large church out in Houston said that he was impressed with the passion of his church to keep the community ministry going during COVID. You know, they masked up and, put on sanitizers and all of that, but they developed a drive-through to keep the feeding ministry going in their community. And he realized the depth of love that his congregation had, the passion for serving the community. Another church that's less than 10 years old, they became aware of the issue of housing more deeply. This is a Pentecostal church, independent Pentecostal church. And the pastor and his leaders put together during the COVID time a strategy for rehabbing houses in their neighborhood, selling them and renting them. And they have already begun the work that they could do electronically, and they put together a corporation. So during that time, they have seen a need and believed that they could respond. Another pastor in a multiracial congregation, and one that's pretty multi-political in its views. And it was just so moving to see how during this time, people began to see their need for each other. Whether we're talking about LGBT folks, whether we're talking about Asians who are in this community, Black Lives Matters group. And one of the things the pastors said, he said they they were doing the Zoom, beginning to learn about the Zoom. He said that one of the very conservative persons said after about 4 weeks, you know, we're starting to worship as a community because everyone is waiting until someone else picks up the line in the Lord's Prayer or the Creed so we can say it together. And the energy to be able to talk about during the coffee hour, and I guess Zoom is safe, but to share and hear how different views were shared. So there was an intimacy, but a safety that this pastor experienced, and so on. So those are some of the kinds of things that I think that we will be able to build upon. One Presbyterian pastor talked about his congregation discovering a new way of evangelism, and several pastors mentioned this, where they have had friends that they have invited to Bible study, to worship, given them the link, even by telephone. One church only uses a telephone conference. They're not real high tech, but they have grown, and they have a daily prayer service that others have joined that were not a part of the church. So, you know, now how that's built upon going forward, one pastor said they think they're going to have 2 congregations because so many people from other places, some of whom had been members but moved away, had joined them by Zoom. And so they're making plans of what it will look like to have a residential congregation, but a ministry that will allow others to be engaged from a distance who have found this ministry meaningful.
Very interesting. Would you say, Nathan, that is it safe to say, and it may not be, that the church's future is outward rather than inward? I think one of the things I worry about is the temptation in times of challenge for churches to turn in on themselves and forget that there's life beyond the walls. What are your thoughts on that dynamic?
My thought is that we have learned, I believe, a lot about the need of the world in ways we would not have if we were not sequestered, both as individuals, but also as a collective in our congregations. And in many ways, it has influenced preaching during COVID. I mentioned Black Lives Matter. I've heard more about preaching about racial justice and equity, but not so much from a prophetic give them hell kind of thing, but a spirit of compassion and concern, which is the particular gift we have as pastors, that even when we speak with a prophetic voice, there is that call to compassion, which can enable ultimately justice and reconciliation. So I've heard more preaching. I've seen it in Bible studies, including my home congregation, where I'm a member, and we have our little Bible studies, and people talking about the concerns, the issue of Asian violence, and violence against Asians, I guess that's what I want to say, has come up. We're aware that the model citizen image of the Asian communities has worked in a way to allow us to ignore the fact that they have been marginalized. We could go on to talk about homelessness. We could go on to talk about the important role of government in the way in which it serves the people, because that is a part of who we are, both in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. We are called to hold accountable governments, be they local or regional or federal. And so I have seen these kinds of things where pastors have really navigated, and it's not been easy, between the pastoral and, as you like to put it, the prophetic. And I think going forward, we will not be able to avoid speaking about these issues, but speaking about them on the premise of compassion, healing, and truth reconciliation.
Wasn't there a fellow named Jesus who did something like what you're talking about?
And it is he whom we emulate, yes.
But it's a very high calling, and it's hard when the stress level's high. So, what would you like to say in closing, that your wisdom after all of your years in service to the church? Any closing thoughts?
Well, I would like to say that two things. One is I encourage pastors to not only think about what has been the nature of their ministry, but what's been the impact upon them. And I speak not only of what we have learned, but about self-care. Coming out of this period, God's going to be making clearer what the call is, how God will use what we have experienced in the COVID period. And we need to be spiritually and physically and psychologically restored. And I just encourage pastors and lay ministers to think about this and then talk to the people with whom they minister so that they can plan some opportunity of renewal for themselves. Secondly, so much of what I have heard and seen shows us how much shared ministry, how important shared ministry is. And going forward, I would hope that we will not only do the work of opening and beginning. I mean, I really hope that congregations will have big parties when they go back in so that they can let the community around them know, we're back, we're alive, we're open, and that sort of celebration. But even more importantly, that there be discernment together, that pastors encourage their congregation and particularly their lay leaders to join them in discerning, hearing, yes, God is still speaking. What is God saying to us? And allow that not only to unfold strategically, but let it unfold in a prayerful way that may not be immediate, but that, as that scripture says, God has chosen us. And so that same God who is reflected in Jesus, how do we now ask about our incarnating the gospel, the good news?
Thank you so much. Many blessings, Nathan. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you, Marty. God bless you. See you on campus.
Yes, hopefully soon.